Hey there. This is Derek McDaniel. Um, I'm just gonna today on this stream. I'm gonna talk about Austrian economics a little bit. So, interesting story. Um, the first before I got into economics or any of that, I was just sort of out of school from studying mathematics, and my dad had this book by Charles Koch, The Science of Success, which is very Austrian driven and about market-based management. Now, in particular, that book, like maybe you might like that management style, but um, I don't really think it's that great. We can get into that later, but later on, I read Mises Human Action, and I like that book generally a lot more than the book by Charles Koch. Um, and it was within the next year or so, I came upon Austrian economics. My biggest issue actually was the minimum wage. I was opposed to it just because I wanted more work flexibility. I thought that would be a good way to have work flexibility. Um, Today, I think of the minimum wage as a productivity standard, so much like a minimum speed limit. So if we set a minimum speed limit on our roads of 15 miles per hour, that would be very comparable of setting a minimum speed limit of $15 per hour on wage-based employment. Now, you still are free to be self-employed, use your own time. So the minimum wage only comes into effect when someone with capital is hiring workers to use that capital. So it's more of a standard on the capital efficiency of labor utilization, not the productivity of workers themselves. Because if you are self-employed, if you are utilizing your own means of production, that's not a standard that then applies to you. But generally, people are less inclined to spend much time and resources. Well, obviously, business owners may go through big losses, but if there isn't a potential of greater profits, people generally won't be self-employed. There's sort of this uncanny valley for employment where it's hard to you go from like nothing to productive, and the time you spend in between maybe not that great. So you don't see a lot of business owners out here making less than minimum wage. um, so that's just something to consider. But yeah, the productivity, the minimum wage is only a productivity standard on the capitalists utilizing labor, our labor resource. So if you want to be self-employed, you're free to go out there and do that. Um, and that's going to be my general viewpoint on the minimum wage. Like $15 an hour isn't an incredibly high standard. The GDP per hour worked is something like 80 for the US, $80 worth of GDP for every hour of labor worked. So there's still a lot of flexibility, and I think it's necessary to have some flexibility in wage offered in order to allow people the greatest discretion and freedom in employment. But if you look at the average productivity per hour work week compared to the minimum allowed, that is a broad range of flexibility. So you have from all the way down to 15 up to 80. That is a broad range of flexibility. So I would argue we have sufficient flexibility in wage bids or wage asks, wage bids by employers have sufficient flexibility to and employees to be able to negotiate and for people to find what they want. So that particular issue, my thinking changed a lot. And I realized the things that make low paying jobs suck, like annoying, aren't necessarily your lack of flexibility in wage. Although theoretically you could alleviate some of those, or like you would have more choice and trade-offs if that productivity standard was lower. It's nice to have an employer because you know you're going to reliably earn that money. So there are some cases where people could make arguments I would agree with, that there might be benefits to more flexibility in wage asks and wage bids. But in general, when you understand phenomenon like market power and such, then you realize when you say free market, it sounds like you're getting stuff for free. No, everything we do in a marketplace is a paid activity. So there is leverage. You are leveraging resources and leveraging claims. There is inherent conflict in that. And so class negotiation isn't things like collective action with the unions and such, isn't necessarily an inherently disruptive thing to our market freedoms. It allows us to express ourselves. And a lot of these group dynamics are actually a vehicle for individual expression, not just a suppression of that. And that's most generally my philosophy. Here, I'm going to share a link to this live stream. So, yeah, I'm just pulling up my Twitter so I can share a link. Okay, so as I was talking about the minimum wage, it's a productivity standard for labor. $15 an hour is somewhat comparable to a 15 mile per hour speed limit. But obviously, that speed limit is not going to apply everywhere. Like if you set a minimum speed limit of 15 miles an hour on the car lanes, people wouldn't have an issue with that. Now, if you set it in a bike lane, that might be harder for people to achieve. But because the option of self-employment exists, minimum wage is not just a requirement on on worker productivity. It's a requirement on when people with capital want to hire labor. So that's the basic summary there. But let's talk a little bit about Austrian economics. Now, there are some things I do like about Austrian economics. They do sort of criticize the empirical emphasis in a way that makes sense to me. Now, my view is sort of we should look at empirical work like debugging a system rather than trying to use it for inferring some kind of universal truth, like something like the Nairu. It's a property of an engineered system, and so if we understand the mechanics of that system, then we can build it better. So I see empirics as sort of like testing, debugging, more of an engineering type discipline rather than a scientific discipline into first principles. Now, if we want to understand the first principles of the economy, that becomes very philosophical, very political. We have to talk about human relations. We have to comparatively look at different historical and biological and even maybe fiction too, and people's beliefs, even religion and stuff like that. But let's try to keep this a little bit narrower. So So what about the approach of Austrian economics do I necessarily not like? It is very individual based, but I think their approach to analysis isn't, they're looking at the wrong thing, basically. Instead of, okay, so what is Austrian economics? I would characterize it as a view of the business cycle, of business cycles under very individualist norms and market systems. So I don't see their assumptions as particularly realistic or even relevant. And there's a slight difference there. Realistic assumptions have to match what we see in the real world, whereas relevant, you can create a model or system that's relevant, even if it's unrealistic. It can be dramatically simplified, but if it has similarities to the real world, then it will be relevant, even if it's not realistic. But Austrian economics is mostly concerned with the business cycle and this concept of investment. Now, these are important economic principles. What I would say you want to study with economics is emergent behaviors. So how individuals acting in their self-interest with independent modes, what are the consequences? What are the consequences of autonomous individuals or groups or whatever units of analysis you choose? What are the consequences of that on large-scale outcomes for the system? So in particular, we want to be value neutral. So we want to be descriptive. So we want to say if we do X, Y will happen. Now, this doesn't mean we have no personal values or even that our personal values will still affect the way we study and approach this stuff, but our analysis should be as objective as possible, and that allows us to apply our values. Because if we rely too much on our values to try to assume something will happen, then that inhibits our ability to actually live out those values, because we'll do X assuming Y will happen, but values are more of a statement about outcomes than they can also be about means, but very philosophical issues. Very difficult to discuss some of these things, but being so concerned with individuals, if you're familiar with system dynamics and system thinking, you can't always model large-scale systems using small pieces. And so in a mathematical and scientific sense, that's where I would say Austrian economics breaks down, because so much emphasis on the individual sovereignty makes it very difficult mathematically to analyze what happens at higher levels of systems. And it makes it so when you construct models or simulations, let's say we constructed a simulation with 10 people, it's not going to be realistic. Now, typically Austrian economists don't do much modeling the way you would see neoclassicals do. You aren't going to see so much of these dynamic stochastic DSGE models. And I agree with that, because I view the empirical side as an engineering discipline where you're testing and debugging an engineering system, not trying to infer first principles. You don't treat the economy like a science experiment, you treat it like a machine, okay? And then we can ask, hey, we built this machine, we built our democracy, our social systems, and we can ask if it's functioning the way it was intended to, or the way we describe it politically and academically. We have a certain norms where we describe, oh, this is our process for making laws, this is all the stuff. So a lot of the times in Austrian economics, they're analyzing a certain ideal according to their values. And I mean, not in all cases, but sometimes, especially like if you look at Bob Murphy's chaos theory book, he's trying to describe a very hypothetical scenario where you don't have governments, it's just all insurance companies. Even like people going to prison is a matter of insurance companies like negotiating with each other to it's I mean, again, I don't think it's very realistic. It does have a certain level of intellectual merit in that it's a useful exercise for thinking about these things. I wouldn't agree with his analysis specifically. I don't even know if my sound is working here, but anyway, how can I see if my sound is working? Well, I'm just going to go on and assume my sound is working. I have a microphone set up. So if this doesn't work out, maybe I'll just delete it later. Okay. Thanks, Titan. Sorry, I don't have this structured very much, but so when you're studying economics, what are you trying to study? I think you're studying how human relations create social outcomes. And so specifically, it doesn't make sense to me the way that Austrian economics takes a very individualist view. And I don't know, maybe this is my own filter, but it seems like they're always saying, oh, it's better to have no regulation, it's better to this is bad. Well, I mean, you don't want to say in analysis that a certain outcome is bad. You just want to connect, okay, if you have this regulation, if you have a minimum wage, then here's the deadweight loss. Now, if you actually do the analysis, a wage standard doesn't create that much deadweight loss because the people who are going to be working for a lower wage aren't even earning that much in the first place. So it's practically a rounding error, especially if you factor in alternatives like self-employment and such. It's very minuscule, the amount of deadweight loss. Even if you have a very conventional view of supply and demand, it's not a big difference. So, yeah, there's a certain thought experiment I have, which is what I call the dictator model. And so that's just, I guess we can even go to another thought experiment. So there's this idea of ceremony, like where you're just acting out a ritual or like a script, like doing a play. So to what extent are human agents in an economy just acting out some predetermined script, like a flash mob or something? Like when you go to the store and hand people money, they hand you back a product. When we conduct our accounting like that, to what extent is it actually impactful, or like it's just a ceremony, like it's just a convention, something we do externally, but that doesn't actually determine the outcomes. So you could imagine a world where people still go to the store and they act out pain and stuff, but nothing happens behind the scenes in bank accounts. No one's ever rejected and such. So it's all just a superficial thing that we do alongside what we were going to do anyway. So, now obviously that's not the case. If you go to the store, you actually have to pay for things. But this thought experiment helps us determine what the actual difference is between our conceptualization between what things are on the surface, like if you have a money token, if you have a coin or something, what's the difference between appearance and the actual underlying dynamics. Maybe that's confusingly stated, but anyway. So, yeah, that idea of ceremony, like what is actually impactful on our resource activities and decisions, and what is just sort of a tradition, sort of an embellishment, sort of decorative almost. And related to that is this thing I call the dictator model. What if, okay, and this comes from the idea of chess. So now using this dictator model is not the same as promoting dictatorship. It's just to ask the question, what's the difference between a dictator determining every move and letting individuals without coordination just act randomly or sporadically? So specifically, if you look at chess or like something like Twitch Plays Pokemon was this activity that streamers used to do where they would let their stream chat play the Pokemon game. So obviously video gaming and streaming is a huge activity. So when you're playing a video game, you have buttons, controllers, so people could type control inputs into chat. And the goal was to allow like random people on the internet to play the game and have it progress. So I guess the dictator model is sort of the opposite of that. If you have an intelligent chess player who's sort of like coordinating everything, like they can, if they're effective and intelligent, they can create any potential outcome. Anything that individuals could do themselves, the skilled chess player could achieve that same outcome. So individuals can just state their preferences, and then the dictator can dictate actions, and then you have potentially optimal outcomes. So that's the point of the dictator model. It's not to promote, hey, dictatorship is actually a good idea. It's just to say, okay, theoretically, in a mathematical sense, if we have a dictator who is just telling everybody what to do, then they can achieve optimal outcomes. Okay? So in what sense does that break down in the real world? How would an actual dictatorship differ from something like a chess match where a skilled player can make the optimal moves? And I think that's one of the limitations in Austrian economics. They don't adequately describe how our social systems constrain us, how our social choice is a matter of affiliation and not just individual preferences. So yeah, there's a particular issue. So if you'll talk to Austrian economics, one surprising thing is if you talk about the history of the United States Civil War, and if you talk about historical figure like Abraham Lincoln and the end of slavery, like a lot of, on the surface, libertarians are about liberty and freedom, but much of the time they're saying Abraham Lincoln was the worst president in U.S. history. Like, if you go online and talk to libertarians, you'll hear this take all the time. Like, the president who defeated slavery, who ended slavery in the United States, is considered the worst president in U.S. history. And so it's like, if you're really for liberty, then why are you opposed to the president who brought slavery to an end? And this really gets to the heart of it, that the libertarian philosophy is more about just the supremacy of property rights rather than individual freedoms and sovereignty. Now, if we want to entertain libertarian philosophy for a minute, let's say we don't like the idea that individuals grow up and they have no choice but to accept the law of the land that they live in. So like in Amish communities, they have this idea called Rumspringa, where they get a year to leave the Amish community and they can decide to come back. But in our country, we don't have something comparable. You can't like grow up and then you turn 18 and then you decide, hey, I don't like our legal system. I would rather live somewhere else. So in a sense, we're obligated to affiliate with our country of birth. Just we don't have any choice in the matter. So let's entertain this libertarian idea where, hey, we want to let everyone voluntarily choose which laws apply to them, which systems they live in. Well, then how do you actually achieve that? That's a good question. But I would say the reason why I don't think that works is because we need some sort of rules to have a balanced society. And while you may not explicitly agree to sign the Constitution yourself, there is a sense in terms of social evolution where you can support or detract from your society. So like having freedom of speech is great because even if in practice the economy is so powerful that individual speech may not make a big difference when you're constrained by economic forces. If you have to work to survive, your speech may not be that powerful, but at least it gives you the opportunity to detract or support. So I would say we may not be able to explicitly accept or reject the law of the land as a contract the way you would with a contract. You don't enter into it explicitly, but we can criticize it, and freedom of speech protects our ability to criticize that. It's just, in a practical sense, it's not practical to let everyone decide to individually accept or reject the Constitution. Like, we don't all have to sign the Constitution. We don't all have to sign the laws. That's just how representative democracy works. So the question I would, in fact, pose to libertarians is, at what point do you have a duty to assist others who are oppressed by unjust government? And if you never have such a duty, like, what's wrong with such unjust governments? Okay, now, if we're steel manning that philosophy, if we're steel manning their concepts, you would say, okay, I can choose to, let's say you're in the North and there's slavery in the South. I can choose to help people escape from slavery, even if I don't feel like I have a duty or imperative to do so. So in the case of the U.S. Civil War, I don't recall if there was a draft specifically or how the Union recruited soldiers, but obviously people were made to pay taxes to support the war effort. They did the whole thing with greenbacks. There was a lot of conscription involved, which is basically the state or the public saying, okay, you have a duty to participate in this effort. And it's just like this community or social organization, like, saying, okay, this is what we want to do, and you all have a duty to do this, to help out with this effort. And so I don't have a problem with that. And if you are categorically against any type of social duty or prescription or set of rules other than the basic tenets of property rights, then most of societies throughout history will fall outside of those moral norms. So most societies have some sense of civic service, public duties, like obviously military conscription. While we may specifically oppose that concept, it is an example of historical duty that has been common in many communities. So if you are going to contend with all that from a moral framework, and you do it in a very dismissive way, just saying, I have complete individual sovereignty, I don't want to be bound by any rules or things, it's just weird. So it ends up, to me, it has the appearance of being like, okay, I want all the benefits of living in a society with rule of law, with property rights, with trade, with markets, with infrastructure. I want the benefits of these things, but I don't want to have the burden of taxation. Or it's just being so picky about how those things are created. Often there's many ways to solve a problem, and people will get into disagreements on the minutia. Like, if we had fought over the font in the Constitution, like, that would have been a roadblock. Like, it's not materially important to the effort. So in a sense, that's the way a lot of these libertarian objections appear to me. They want everyone to voluntarily sign a contract, voluntarily agree to all conditions and rules, but they aren't necessarily opposed to rules. They aren't necessarily opposed to people charging rent, but they are opposed to taxes. So it's a contradiction. They don't hate HOAs for telling people what they can do with their houses and lawns and such. Well, some of them very well may, but the idea is, if that's an HOA contract, then libertarian philosophy would say, you can do that. You can have ordinances and codes that are just contractually tied to your ownership. But the moment it's administered as a local government, it violates their philosophy. And that seems to me like somewhat of a contradiction. Just to be that particular about this boundary between what we call government or private ownership. It's just a set of rules we have to follow to live in a society. That's the way I see it. Now, let's talk a little bit about libertarian books and stuff. So there's a lot of books out there and different authors. So if you go back to the early days of the Austrian School of Economics, it actually, a lot of it coincides with neoclassical economics too. If you go clear back to Karl Menger, he was an early Austrian school economist, and if I believe, that's where the idea of marginalism comes from, where just this philosophy for understanding price. Now, a lot of this can't really describe very well off the top of my head, so just do some research there on marginalism and Karl Menger. And so one of the most famous libertarian or Austrian school economists was obviously Ludwig von Mises. And in a sense, if you go back and read a lot of Keynes, John Maynard Keynes, like Mises, his thinking reflected what Keynes was dealing with a lot of the time. Although Mises sort of developed and refined the conventional thinking in contradiction to Keynes. So he was a contemporary of John Maynard Keynes, Mises was, and he was well aware of him. So that's why you hear a lot of libertarian types that call themselves classical liberals, just like individual self-sovereignty and such, and opposed to any regulation or impositions on the states by states on markets. So if you want to study Mises a lot, it helps to be reading a lot of Keynes at the same time, regardless of which side of the aisle you're on. Because they were contemporaries, they're dealing with a lot of the same issues at the time. But if you just want to get into Mises, the book Human Action is his most notable work. And people talk a lot about praxeology, praxis. Um, just what libertarians will call the action axiom, that what people do is a true indicator of preferences. Now, if you talk about theory of mind and cognitive science, this sounds very similar to behavioralism, which is what people do. Like, the only way we can analyze what people think is by what they do. Now, behavioralism has been rejected by modern behavioral science and cognitive science just because we have a really good understanding of how computers work today, how mind works, how intent may differ. So, in terms of the action axiom, which is like what you actually want is what you do, the way I would contend with that is it's a useful idea, but it's just taken too far. I would call it the action indicator. So actions are one indication of people's inside intent, and there can be a lot of random chance involved as well. Just in random outcomes can result in what you attempt to do being different from what actually happens, or there can be lots of layers to your decision making. And I mean, if you play chess at all, you're aware like lots of factors on the board will affect your decision. So if you try to be reductive, saying, "Oh, you did X because of Y, you moved your pawn because of their knight," or something like that, you have to consider the entire state of the board to understand every decision someone makes. And the same is true of real-world decisions. And there's even private information that you may not see. So that's sort of how I would contend with this idea of an action axiom. I would call it an action indicator, whereas it is one tool among many tools to assess intent, including just asking someone directly, "Hey, what do you want to happen?" Like, a lot of times polls may not be reliable because people responding to a poll may say one thing, like, "Oh, I like this flavor of ice cream," but then when they actually go to a restaurant, they may order a different one. Now, there could be 100 different factors in that, so we just have to be able to consider all of that. So yeah, if you're talking about Mises, Human Action is the book to get a general idea of what he thought. Now, there's tons of writing by him over years and years. Then we can get to, okay, another text this is actually a really good, it's very approachable to read. It's called Economics in One Lesson. It's by Hazlitt. And it is mostly about the broken window fallacy, where this idea where if you break windows, it'll make the economy more active, and that's good for the economy. Now, the way that's a fallacy is it sort of mischaracterizes how investment works. So the window represents an investment, and when you destroy it, you destroy wealth. So even if you are in the short term generating more activity, it does reduce wealth. But there are more complicated issues, like Austrians will try to infer too much of that, just about the business cycle and different things and employment. Like they try to say there's no role for stimulus in creating employment, but I think that's categorically wrong. Just because we have property rights, and property rights are an exclusive claim, and as soon as it's like traffic control. If you give one person access to a green light, it'll block the other directions. And so, in order to prevent gridlock, you have to take certain measures as a public to keep things flowing smoothly. Anyway, So just something to consider. Economics in One Lesson by Hazlitt is actually a decent read. It's very approachable. It's less dense and like philosophical than some of these other ones. Now, obviously, if you are very, very good at critical reading, I wouldn't necessarily recommend you study these books because obviously I think they're flawed and problematic. So you have to learn to read with a critical viewpoint. And one of the hardest things when you do that is actually admitting, hey, a lot of this stuff is correct, or I agree with this, or it's a good idea. But then just identifying, okay, this is the point where I think they're misrepresenting things, they're drawing false inferences, false conclusions. So just being able to find that cutoff from point A where they're like, okay, this is a good argument, this is good logic, and then point B where it's like, no, that's very difficult. When people create narratives, it's sort of like a river. It sweeps you away. So it takes you from one logical point to another. So most people have a very difficult time accepting the start of an argument and then, rejecting its conclusion, because either they'll like say, oh, I don't even accept your starting premises, or they'll go the full way. So it's having a nuanced discussion where you're able to say, okay, this is actually the exact point where I disagree with you, where my view branches off from your view. That is a very challenging skill. So that's what I would recommend. Obviously, you can read Rothbard, Man, Economy, and State with Power and Markets. A lot of these books are basically things people spent their whole lives writing, like 20, 30 years. Maybe not specific. They're at least a refinement of ideas they developed over decades and such. So there is at least a certain amount of intellectual merit in these works, even if I don't agree with them, just because of the amount of labor that was put into making them, and the amount of care that they took in representing their ideas. So you can see, hey, this is where they went off a little bit. But anyway, that's just some of my thoughts on Austrian economics. If you don't have good critical thinking skills, then maybe start with something simpler, like Wealth of Nations would be an easier starting point if you have trouble disentangling conflicting ideas. Just reading Wealth of Nations. It's been a while. I don't know that I've read the entire thing, Wealth of Nations, from cover to cover, but it's one of those things it's so historically important, you can become familiar with what it talks about without reading it in its entirety. Sometimes old works are harder to read because back in the day, people, when they got a book, that was like the only book they had. Like, so there's maybe a lot less care in attention management in older writing styles. They just assume, hey, if you have this book, it's important to you already. And so, yeah, older books can be a lot less gentle to the reader, which maybe you like that style. Yeah, because when you get bored, it sort of inspires creativity. And so back in the day, people were a lot more willing to work through difficult texts than they are now. And the same could be said of video games. Like early video games, you would buy one game and you would own it. And so like they needed to be more challenging, almost frustrating at times. So that's what it is. In terms of classical economics texts, I've read several chapters of General Theory by Keynes. I've read some of Marx. I haven't read that much of Marx. Das Kapital, I just found it very boring. I would rather Some of this stuff is just easier secondhand. You have to realize it was never my intent to go about studying economics. So a lot of this is just, I just found myself over time just getting sucked into this. So like if I sat down and deliberately was like, oh, I'm going to study the field of economics and the history of it, my approach, if I had sat down like that, my approach might have been different. I might have tackled some of these foundational texts more directly rather than over years and years sort of getting an idea of what they say secondhand. But just for the sake of completeness, it's a good idea to be familiar with a wide variety of sources, and a lot of these classical texts from Marx, Das Kapital, obviously Wealth of Nations, and then General Theory, Keynes. And if you want to get into the deep end, you can go read some Austrian texts like Human Action, Economics in One Lesson, Man, Economy, and State. I'm trying to think of any other Austrian texts. You could even read Per Byland's book, like a guide to thinking about economics or something. As argumentative and boneheaded he can be on online discussion, his text actually seems very approachable. I just didn't find it particularly interesting because I have read some of these other Austrian texts like Mises and Rothbard and Hazlitt and such. So, it just didn't seem that relevant to me to read Per Byland's particular book. But it is a more modern writing style, it appeared, and more approachable. And yeah, so maybe a good read if you're very casual about trying to parse this whole Austrian thing. Now, there is actually, if you look at the history of modern monetary theory, like Minsky was the predecessor to that. Now, Minsky has inspired others besides the MMTers. Probably the biggest example is, why can't I think of his name? I talk about him all the time. The banking expert. I had a total brain fart. Okay, give me 1 second here. Oh, Perry Marilyn. So Marilyn is another, do you say protege, or he's another, I'll just say student of Minsky and of the Minskyan view, whereas the MMTer's Randall Wray was a student of Minsky. Now, Minsky himself, I don't know too much about Minsky. Obviously, he's famous for his financial stability hypothesis. Stability creates instability. Whereas if there's financial stability, that inspires more confidence, and then people will create more risks. And over time, you'll get like sort of a systemic conditioning to take on more risk until you get huge failures. And there's ways with risk management to manage small risks, which can keep things running, but create long-term. It's almost like it escalates the level of risk, like insurance products. Obviously, like an insurance product will protect one person from failure, but if you have a nationwide disaster, if you had like Yellowstone blow up, like it would be difficult to use insurance to address an issue at a large scale like that. But Minsky, very interesting historical figure, but he apparently one of his teachers was Joseph Schumpeter. And Joseph Schumpeter was actually an Austrian. He was from Austria, but from my understanding, he wasn't an Austrian school economist, although he was exposed to that a lot. Schumpeter's most famous book is Capitalism, Socialism, and Democracy, which is a very interesting historical thesis. I've read certain chapters or sections of the book. It is a long book, like a lot of these older texts are. I don't think his thesis is necessarily accurate, but it is very interesting in that it's a different idea between like this socialism versus capitalism. Sort of a different approach. His idea was like, yeah, eventually capitalism will get taken over by bureaucracies and stuff, which he generally saw as a bad thing. So somewhere on the line between Schumpeter to Minsky to our modern MMT, like there was a big shift in thinking about financial systems and markets and the role they play in public-private balance. But it's very interesting. So I would say Schumpeter is a legitimately interesting author, whereas on his own, he has interesting ideas. Whereas some of these Austrian characters, they're only interesting because they represent such... They're only interesting online. I'll say that. There's so many online people who just like these ideas because I would say they have very simple assumptions, very direct assumptions, and I find them unrealistic as well. That doesn't mean their analysis can't be useful or none of their contributions are valuable, because there are smart people who work with this framework, but much of what they do isn't very relevant because their assumptions are so unrealistic. Now, if you have a very specific problem and the assumptions are sort of a good match, like if you were trying to trade commodity markets or something, well, I really would go to Austrians for that. I'm trying to think. I think there's very niche issues where the Austrian viewpoint can be valuable. I can't think of good examples at the moment, but they do a lot of work. It is this very it's a dedicated set of people, so I'll just say that. But anyway, some things to check out. I know that's a little bit of a like a rant or incoherent stream, but this is why I do better on Twitter when I'm forced to condense my thoughts rather than just having these open-ended soliloquies. But that's going to be it for today.